There's a couple of very broken weapons in Elden Ring. Usually there are concessions that armaments or weapons have. Sometimes they have strengths, but those strengths are... there's an equilibrium between the strengths and also the weaknesses of the weapon. When it comes to the Darkmoon blade, saying it's just pure raw power. There are no weaknesses, there are no downsides about this weapon. Everything is just so broken. And one of those aspects of this weapon being so broken is the build in itself. Because out of all of the builds that you have out there, this is one of the ones that have some of the most possible buffs that you can attach to the weapon, whether if it's by spells, by talismans, by ashes of war. There's just so much stuff that this weapon has going on for it that it is going to increase and potentialize the damage of this thing that much. That being said, if that is just not enough, which is not enough, it barely consumes any kind of FP. So the trade-off, you would say, to some extent, that you would be losing the usage of the spells that you are going to have with this weapon, because yes, intelligence spells actually do use quite a lot of FP. In this case scenario, you don't actually lose any of that either, because the FP consumption on this weapon, it's almost non-existent. You're barely going to consume any kind of FP. The build is going to, the weapon it's not. It also deals a substantial, it's not the best, by all means, it's not the best posture damage that you are going to deal to the enemies with this weapon, but it is very respectable when you charge the heavy attack. It's around 30-ish kind of points into poise, so it requires like 2 or 3 hits for you to be able to stun some enemies, and then just a couple more against bosses. You're always going to be dealing a lot of critical hits as well with this thing. And the range, it also has range, so it's just nuts, it's just amazing. So let's talk about the stats that we're going to have with this weapon, with this build. Remember that we have the hard cap. Hard cap is going to be the most important thing, because when we reach our hard cap, it's going to give us at around 800 AR, which is very important for our damage output of our weapon. The hard cap of intelligence is going to be at 80 points right there. The values are not that substantial beyond 50, but we're also going to be using quite a lot of spells that are going to complement the build, and they actually require quite a bit of intelligence. Now when it comes to strength and dexterity, you want to have them on 20 and 14 because of the shield. They are a shield requirement for the build that we have right here. Vigor, anything in between 40 to 60, it's always ideal. You can tailor this to your personal preferences. This is a 150 build. If you want to go higher, placing points in here is always a nice idea. And then my endurance, I place them evenly right here, because you don't need either of. You're not going to be using that many spells, you're not going to be using that many FP, but you're also not going to be using heavy armor. Well, you can use heavy armor if you want to reach the 51 points that you have to bypass the attacks of the enemies, because the weapon doesn't have that much of hyper armor. That's one of the downsides, because you're not using an Ash of War per se to attack, and usually the Ashes of War, they are the ones that have the hyper armor. These are just going to be just basic regular attacks. So the armor and equipment, of course, we have the spell blade set. You don't actually need this. This is going to be 8% damage, which in the grand scheme of things, it's actually quite a lot, because you have quite a lot of damage, so that's always boosted right there. But if you feel that your poise is not the one that you desire to have right here, you can by all means place some more points into endurance, and then change this for something different, as you see me doing all throughout the rendition of the playthrough. However, just to have in mind that the spell blade armor set, it is going to give you plus 8% magic damage, that it is going to affect the beams of your weapon. The jellyfish, shield is going to give us an extra 20% damage. We regularly do not use this shield with different weapons that use the Ashes of War as a main means of damage, but the thing is that the attacks that you have with this weapon, the Ash of War attacks that you have with this weapon, is that you use the Ash of War of the sword and then you use heavy charge attacks to do the basic regular attacks. So you can be using the Jellyfish shield to buff your damage. It lasts for 30 seconds and then it is going to give us a plus 20% extra damage. As for the catalyst, you are going to be using the Carian Regal Scepter because he increases the damage of the one spell that we are going to be using, but that's not going to be the main means of damage. That is just going to be a potentialized something to increase the damage of the weapon. We'll get to that in a little bit later on. The Talismans. Shadow of Alexander is always a general talisman, 15% extra damage. Then we have the Godfrey icon, which is going to increase the damage of your charge attacks, which you should always be charging. If you don't, then that's okay, but that's extra 15% damage right there. Then the Magic Scorpion Charm, plus 12% more damage, more magic damage. Overall, more magic damage. So this affects also the spells that you are going to be using. Like I said, you are not going to be using spells for damage per se, but that is a little extra something if you do actually want to use spells right here. Now, it's worth mentioning that the Axe Talisman could also give us extra percentage in damage. It's not that much. It doesn't affect the beam that much. On patch 107 they did add blade detection, a hitbox to the weapon, so if you're point blank onto the enemy, you can by all means deal extra damage. But I have noticed on my testing, and this is just personal me, I don't think that it increases the damage that much. In my testing, it has given me like 100 points extra damage, and that is because the main damage comes from the beam, and then you have extra little damage from the swing of the weapon. So that little extra percentage is not going to be multiplied by everything that we have right here. For example, Shadow of Alexander, Godfrey Icon, so on and so forth. It's going to be independent something for the blade, so it really is not worth to have the Axe Talisman. That being said, you can play and toy around here with some different things, like for example Earth 3 Favor, that it is going to allow you to use heavier armor, provided that you do want to bypass that extra 8% points into damage. There's a couple of more talismans that you have right here. For example, the Lord's Talisman is also very useful as well, because we are going to be using quite a bit of spells, and that it is going to increase our potential DPS without having to worry that much about our spells disappearing too soon. So there's a little bit of versatility that you can have right here. The spell. The main reason why we are going to be using Ranni's Full Moon instead of Renala, this is also going to increase the damage by our Carian Regal Scepter. However, like I said, that is not the main thing that we're going to be using this thing for. The thing is that every time that you cast this thing, it's going to apply a debuff to the enemy, that it is going to decrease their damage resistance to magic by 10%. But also it has frostbite, quite a lot of frostbite. That's something that I didn't mention with the weapon, that the weapon is also going to be dealing frostbite. If you combine these two guys right here, they are going to frostbite the enemy, dealing damage, and not only dealing damage, but also reducing the resistances, their overall resistances to damage by 20%. And that is actually multiplicative, so it's going to add on top of each other, being like 30 minus 32% to some extent rather on the overall damage, extra damage that the enemy is going to take. And that is going to be summed up by the rest of the buffs and debuffs that we have on the builds. So we'll multiply all of that at the end of the video. We'll not talk about specific raw numbers, but the damage is just going to be amazing. Then we have Terra Magica. Terra Magica, every time that you're stepping on top of the sigil, that it is going to increase all of your magic sources damage by 35%. That is also going to apply to the Darkmoon blade beams. So that's actually quite nice. If you pair all of these debuffs and all of those buffs together, fighting against bosses, there's some really tough bosses that you can one-shot because of how much damage you can deal with these builds. And properly buffed and apply the debuffs to the enemies, you are going to be dealing in between 2.5 to 5k damage, which is nuts. And in some instances where the enemy is just overall non-resistant to magic on itself, it can reach even higher amounts that, remember again, you can spam. It doesn't take long for you to be able to spam this from a safe distance even. Now the Crystal Tears. The Crystal Tears are actually quite interesting as well, as of course you are going to be using the Magic Shroud on Cracked Tear to increase your magic damage by quite a lot. This is for 3 minutes, I believe, if I am not mistaken, for 20%. Now, one thing that I did want to add, that I do want to mention as well, is that this is also affected by the 107 patch, that it is going to increase the charge attacks for a brief time, but have in mind that most of the damage comes from the laser beam. The physical shotgun kind of point blank damage that comes from the blade, it's not actually that much, so it is not going to be increased that much. Roughly paired up with the Axe Talisman, it's going to give you like 150 damage, which, yes, if you want to, it can be used. It's a little bit extra damage, but I wouldn't sacrifice something very useful. Like, for example, I know that I said that you are not going to be using a lot of FP with this build, and that is true. That's actually true. But when you are buffing yourself, because you are going to be using buffs, you do want to use the buff from the weapon itself, from the blade itself, from the jellyfish, and then from the Terra Magica, and then you want to have you have to cast Rani, Darkmoon as well. That it is going to convey and translate into quite a lot of FP that you are going to spend for preparation. And then if later on you need to prepare yourself again, or you need to cast yourself again, then you are going to somehow struggle if you do not have enough FP. So having the chance to eliminate all of that buffing in the first stance of the fight, it's a game changer. So that's why I advise for you to use the Cerulean Hidden Tia instead of that little extra 80-ish, 100-ish damage. That's why. So the overall damage that we are going to reach: Shadow of Alexander 15%, Godfrey Icon 15% more damage, Magic Scorpion Charm 12% more damage, Magic Shroud Cracked Tear 20% more damage, Jellyfish Shield plus 20% more damage, Spellblade Armor Set 8% more damage, Terra Magica plus 35% more damage, the spell, the Rani Darkmoon, minus 10% magic resistance, and then frostbiting the enemy minus 20% resistance to overall damage. So if we multiply all of that, I am not that smart, but if we infer the amount of damage that we are going to be dealing with this, you have the basic just raw numbers without adding any kind of multipliers to anything on the screen. But I would say that it's safe to say that it could be at around 200% total damage that you are going to deal extra by using all of this stuff. So it's filthy. It's just filthy, and I love it. There really is no downsides about this build and about this weapon. This is the best possible build that you can have for this weapon. If you like the content, like it, never super appreciated. And also, there you go, just a beautiful person. You're indeed a gorgeous and beautiful, beautiful person. Have a lovely, lovely day, and goodbye. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, join the Discord. We'll play Elden Ring right there. Shadow of the Art Tree. Almost here. Have a lovely day, and goodbye.